Greetings, everyone. I'm Drishti Choudhary, your moderator today, and we are having a panel discussion on Israel Palestine conflict. Before we start with the panel discussion with our respective panelists, I would like to give you a background and context of the conflict. Hamas, which is a militant group of Palestine, it launched an attack on Israel on 7th October 2023. And since then, more than 1,400 Israelis and more than 5,000 Palestinians have been killed in the war so far. The conflict between Israel and Palestine dates back to 19th century, which is around 1947-48. In 2021, Hamas and Israel, they agreed for a ceasefire. So this attack, which was sudden, it comes as a shock to not only Israel but the international community as well. Many countries, including US, UK, they have supported Israel, and others have shown solidarity with Palestine. With this context, we should begin our panel discussion. We have our panelists, Dr. Roshni Sengupta and Ms. Sudeshna Choudhary, associate professors with School of Modern Media and expert in their respective fields. So my first question is to you, Roshni ma'am. I would like you to give an historical background on the Israel-Palestine conflict that is going on.
Okay, let me start with correcting you for 1 second about the beginning of the conflict. Of course, the modern version of what we know as the Israel Palestine conflict begins in 1948, as you rightly said. But the roots of this go way back into a bifurcation of narratives. So, what has happened over the years, decades, centuries even, is the fact that there are two narratives that have developed around this conflict between Israel and Palestine. One being the Israeli narrative and the other being the Palestinian narrative. So, at different points in time, one kind of sees one of these narratives being the dominant narrative around the world. So, let's look at the Israeli story for 1 minute. Um, the Jews have always claimed that the community begins from the biblical prophet Abraham and his son Isaac, and his son Isaac's son Jacob, who was then later renamed as Israel. Um, After which this area is called Israel, right? The modern nation of Israel. That's the Jewish interpretation, the Jewish story. But there was a time in back in history where this area was known as Judah, the kingdom of Judah, from where the word Jews comes, because these were people from the kingdom of Judah, so therefore they're known as Jews, right? Also, let's also consider the fact that the Jews are the most dispersed and displaced community in the entire world. The word diaspora comes from the English word dispersion. It's a Greek word with its roots in the English word dispersion, which comes essentially from the dispersion of the Jews to different parts of the world, right? So this area, once after it was the kingdom of Judah, it was taken over by the Babylonians, the Greeks, and later the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, and so on and so forth. Cut to 1948, the modern period. In 1947, actually, the United Nations kind of adopted what is known as Resolution 181, which was known as the Partition Plan. And the Partition Plan divided the British mandated Palestine, which was at that point a Muslim majority state, into Arab and Jewish states, right? So a modern nation of Israel was created. Um, but remember, the Jews don't look at it as a modern nation. The Jews look at it as a civilizational nation, right? So this modern nation of Israel was created then in 1947, which sparked the first Arab-Israeli war, which ended in 1949 with Israel's victory, and about 800,000 Palestinians were displaced um, within the territory that we see today as Israel and Palestine, where it was divided into the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, the West Bank, which is on the banks of the Jordan River, therefore known as the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Remember, Palestine is now divided almost diagonally in the middle by the modern state of Israel. On one side, you have Gaza, on the other side, you have West Bank. The West Bank is the larger territory. So, this area has been in conflict ever since the modern conflict has continued ever since then. There has always been tension in the area, particularly between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, the three principal powers in that region. Now, a lot of Palestine, of course, is recognized as a country, as a state, as an independent autonomous state by a number of countries, but an equal number of countries in the world do not recognize it as an independent state even today. But Israel, on the other hand, is heavily militarized because of their sort of insecure position in the region, where they're surrounded on all sides. Of course, one side is the sea, but on all the sides, all the other three sides, by very, very hostile nations, right? So, following the 1956 Suez Canal crisis and Israel's invasion of the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt, Jordan and Syria then got into a pact with Israel. Um, and then, that violence or that escalation kind of stopped there. Then in 1967, the Egyptian president, the then Egyptian president, Mr. Gamal Abdel Nasser, um, was getting into some political maneuvers in the region, which Israel saw as hostile to its security and territory, and which that this is what sparked what is known as the Six Day War, where Egypt, Israel, and Syria were in conflict with each other, right? So after this war, Israel gained territorial control over the Sinai Peninsula. I don't know if you have a map of the region there, but if you do, then you put it on the screen, and you can see the Sinai Peninsula there and the Gaza Strip. So Israel essentially took the Gaza Strip from Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula as well, and it sort of also took over the West Bank and eastern Jerusalem from Jordan. Remember, this is very interesting. Jerusalem is neither at this point in time. It's neither part of Palestine nor is it part of Israel. West Jerusalem is claimed by Israel. Eastern Jerusalem is claimed by the Palestinians as the future capital of a independent Palestinian state. It was only during Donald Trump's presidency that uh, Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa compound, and so on and so forth um, was sort of recognized by the United States as part of Israel. Till until then, Jerusalem was not recognized as part of Israel at all. Nor was it recognized as part of Palestine. It was a disputed territory. It is still a disputed territory. Um, so therefore, way before, about 50 years before October 7th, 2023 happened, something called the Yom Kippur War happened when Egypt and Syria, Lebanon and Syria both um, got together to mount an attack on Israel, very similar to what happened on October 7th. But of course, it wasn't as militarized as it is now. So the events of October 7 were essentially 50 years and one day later from the Yom Kippur War in 1973. So therefore, you see the history of this region has been conflictual. There is the area is heavily militarized, and Israel has armed itself, militarized itself, primarily owing to the fact that it is surrounded by hostile nations, and the hostilities have increased over the years with regard to the fact that Palestine is regarded worldwide as occupied territory, right? Yeah, so that's essentially the in very very brief terms the history of the conflict. But of course, I can get into a lot of details, but I don't know if you have enough time for that. But as the discussion goes along, I think we'll go over all of this.
Thank you, ma'am. So we have heard the history, and because of that background, we are where we are in the current conflict. So, what would you say about the current conflict on the Israel-Palestine?
See, Israel is facing growing international pressure to rethink plans for a ground invasion in Gaza, where it is relentlessly bombing. Now there has been a lot of international pressure, even in the United Nations. Antonio Guterres, UN head, has given a statement that Israel has a right to attack, because Israel is threatened by the Hamas, but the retaliation has to be in proportion. Yeah, right now, more than 17,000 Palestinians are wounded, and close to 7,000 Palestinians are dead. There have been incidents where hospitals also has been bombed. So Israel is definitely facing a lot of international pressure currently. Now, what Biden has said, and US is a great ally of Israel. But for the first time, what Biden, and I'll quote him, he has said, I continue to be alarmed about extremist settlers attacking Palestinians in the West Bank. They are attacking Palestinians in places that they are entitled to be. So he has, for the first time, a US president has used the word settlers for the Israelis, because they are settlers as far as West Bank is concerned, which is rightfully something that should belong to Palestine. So this is something that has come out from the US president, and he has also mentioned that he's going to redouble his efforts for a two-state solution as far as this particular war is concerned, so that there can be a sort of permanent solution, to this particular conflict, which has been going on for a very, very long time now. Now, as far as Netanyahu, the head of Israel is concerned, he's obviously declared a ground entry in Gaza. However, as of now, they are not going for a complete siege. They have delayed an expected invasion for now, so that the United States can rush his missile defense system to the region and protect his troops there. Now, Israel has also, opened up some gates so that some amount of aid can at least, reach Gaza from Egypt, and a lot of other countries, including India, has voiced, that they would be more willing to supply aid. So right now, as we see this, the bombings continue, but how far it will go, for how many days it will go, because there has been a mounting pressure on Israel to actually, stop this. So we'll have to wait and watch on that, because the world leaders are now talking to each other.
Moving forward, considering the international pressure that she's saying, but we are also aware that there is an international hand as well in the conflict, be it US or Iran. What would you say about that, ma'am?
So let me go back a little into discussing the US role in the Israel Palestinian conflict. Of course, the US played a role along with the British in the creation of the Israeli state way back in 1947, and since then has stood pretty much very, very strongly in support of the Israeli state and the heavy militarization that it has been undertaking since then. Um, the United States backed Israel against the Arab coalition during the Third Arab Israeli War as well in 1973. And US President Jimmy Carter hosted the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin at Camp David. This was the first Camp David conference, the peace talks, Camp David peace talks in 1978-79. But after that, of course, as you know, the intifadas happened, the two intifadas, and PLO was one of the most important organizations to come out of the conflict in this region, led by Yasser Arafat. But since PLO and since the sort of the disintegration of PLO into organizations that are more radically fundamentalist, such as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and other uh, Sunni Islamic or Shiite Islamic forces in Syria and so on. Iran's role is very, very important for us to consider here, because Hezbollah is seen as a proxy of Iran in the region. And Iran has been strongly arming it. Iran has been arming it, Iran has been funding it, and Iran, of course, wants to be a part of the politics, the geopolitics of the region, and it is one of the strong contenders for the leadership position in the region, and wants to be there, right? And it's coming. It wants to, I mean, of course, if it's contending for leadership position in the region, it comes directly in conflict with the United States, which is also a strong presence as a big supporter of Israel in the region. So this is a direct confrontation. What you see now is a direct confrontation, a war of words, not just a war of words, perhaps a war of actions also in future between the United States and the Iran in the region, of course. Um, but the only thing that we need to think about also is the fact that a lot of the Islamist movements in the region, such as Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, are Sunni, whereas Iran is a Shia, is a dominantly Shia, predominantly Shia. Therefore, the support essentially comes via Hezbollah. So it's a very very complex problem. The role of the other Arab nations here is also to be considered. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia are two countries that have that started to make, and Jordan, of course, that started to get into this mode of a rapprochement with Israel. Jordan recognized Israel, Bahrain recognized Israel. Saudi Arabia was on its way to recognize Israel as a state. The other Arab nations do not recognize Israel as a state. Iran does not recognize Israel as a state. But Jordan and Bahrain do. Saudi Arabia was almost on its way to doing it when this October 7th incident happened, and then, of course, you see how it has spiraled into something much worse. Um, so what you see now is a full scale international geopolitical conflict where where a lot of geopolitical players are facing off against each other, and the two major powers that are facing off right now are the United States and Iran in this region, with China somehow trying to place itself in the equation, and Russia also trying to make its presence felt in the region.
Uh, with the India's stand, India supported Israel, but it has also supported or they have shown solidarity with Palestine. It is one of the states which has recognized Palestine as a state. How do you think India is going to balance, its relations with both Palestine and Israel?
Look, India earlier had a very strong stand of non-alignment. So in 1974, India became the first non-Arab country to actually validate and recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is PLO. Now, in 1988, India became one of the first countries to recognize the Palestinian state. In 1996, India opened a representative office in Gaza, which is then shifted to Ramallah. So India has recognized, Palestine as a state. Now, India-Israel vision on defense cooperation is huge. We have very, very good defense relations with Israel that we saw during the Kargil War, where Israel provided India with limited support. So that goes without saying. A lot of tourists from India also go to Israel. So there's a lot of revenue exchange that happens on those fronts. But what is very important to understand is that there are three major Israeli communities who have called India home for the last 2,000 years. Yes, they are the Bene Israeli, the Baghdadi Jews, and the Bene Moshe. The Bene Moshe, mostly you will find them in the northeast region, the Baghdadi Jews and the Bene Israeli in Mumbai and in Calcutta. Some of them are in Calcutta, and a very small population maybe in Gujarat. So India has been home to these particular Jewish community who, even if you go and speak to them in Israel, they identify themselves very significantly as Indians. They got cricket to Israel. Then the Promised Land, 1948, when the Promised Land was declared, they started obviously migrating. So in that sense, Israel and India had very significant ties. So we'll have to see where India stands right now. India has already suggested that they are willing to give aid to Palestine, but Modi has also openly condemned the attack that has happened on Israel. So India has to play this very carefully, given that India and Israel share very, very good defense relations, which has really, and the relation has improved under this particular government, and earlier it wasn't so.
Uh, as we mentioned, as you also mentioned, there are more than 7,000 people who have been died. There are hundreds and thousands of people who have been killed. What do you think, both of you? This question is to both of you. What do you think is the human rights concerns in this entire conflict that is either being ignored or is being taken care of? How do you both think about that?
Well, there is, of course, every conflict area, every conflict zone um, experiences or is witness to several human rights excesses against parties that are in conflict, right? So here we see a very large number of displaced people, and the a majority of those displaced people are women and children. We also see a very large number of people who see themselves as victims, as historical victims on both sides of the divide, right? The Palestinians see themselves as historical victims. The Israelis or the Jewish people also see themselves as historical victims. So we have to look at it as a whole, as a complex situation where both the parties see themselves as victims here. So you are looking at a very intense two-pronged war of narratives that is going on in the world. With social media, it gets compounded. The Everything that is happening in the area gets compounded, right? Of course, it is advantageous to the extent that you get news instantaneously from the region and you don't depend on television or newspapers to give you that news. You get it from people who are there, who are like just common Palestinians or common Israelis who are broadcasting stuff. But the other thing that is happening in that region is that there is an intense, like I said, war of words or war of narratives that is going on, which we as outside observers should be a little careful about. As far as human rights is concerned, like I said, the an area, a conflict area, is always witness to human rights excesses. Of course, it should be avoided as much as possible. Um, Particularly against the elderly, particularly against women and children. But when you have two sides which see themselves as historical victims, it becomes really, really hard to point fingers at one side and say that, boss, you are at fault here, because then the other side will turn around and say, but hey, what about what you did, right? So that is it really needs a very, very complex understanding of the situation. Um, of course, the United Nations is working very hard on the ground. Some of the Israeli air raids have hit refugee camps, which of course the United Nations is and the UNHCR is bringing out. It's been talking about it. It's been putting all the news out on social media as well. So we know that human rights abuses have continued in the region. Human rights abuses are continuing as we speak, and it's a tense, painful situation, right? But a complex one and a very, very intensely political one, with both sides claiming to be victims. So, therefore, a very, very deep understanding is required before we, make a statement about who is wrong and who is right in the conflict.
So, there is a huge trust deficit between Israel and Palestine. Israel and anybody who is of Arab descent. There's a huge trust deficit. Now, if you look at the map of Israel, you see they're building a wall. They're actually building a wall to separate the Palestinians from the Israelis. Now, this is something that has not been supported by many countries, including India. It's actually literally a wall, and the Palestinians are supposed to stay on this side, and the Israelis will stay on this side. Now, the whole point is, even in areas where, on paper, it should belong to Palestine, the Israelis stay, and therefore they are known as settlers. And a parts of it is something which is controlled by IDF, Israeli Defense Forces. Now, there's a complete appetite which goes on in that particular region because, the IDF is there, the soldiers are with Israel. So there are roads where, Palestinians cannot walk, There are roads where the Israelis or anybody in the world can, walk or travel. Only the Palestinians are not allowed. And then there are roads where the Palestinians can open a shop, but they cannot walk. And then there are roads where Palestinians are not allowed at all. Now they are not allowed. So this is something that even a lot of Israelis who have worked for Israeli Defense Forces and are now for peace have said, quote unquote, that this is a kind of apartheid against Palestinians. To do in these areas, which are controlled by IDF and occupied by Israeli quote unquote settlers, the Palestinians need permission to leave their homes. They have to show their cards to the IDF. So it's a very dehumanizing experience for the Palestine, which will eventually create a lot of like trust deficit between this two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. Now the thing is, the settlers, there are hundreds of thousands of settlers that the Israeli government has moved into these particular territories, which should actually belong to Palestine. The Gaza Strip, which is basically a narrow strip of land, is one of the most densest populated areas in the world. So someone has it's when someone talks about a two-state solution, Israelis have to listen to Palestine, or Palestinian people have to listen to Israelis. But who is going to bell the gap? Who is going to take that step and leave territory? You have to understand it's a territorial war, end of it. So that is something which would need some kind of intervention, international intervention, and probably the United Nations can do something about it.
Carrying forward that thought, the international community's role in a peaceful resolution to the Israel Palestine conflict. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, the United Nations can obviously do a lot. First, it was League of Nations, and then it became the United Nations when this idea of having a separate country of Israel was floated. The United Nations is in a catch-22 situation. You have to understand the United Nations is not a country as such. It can, bring forward a lot of countries, put them in a table, and discuss this too. But there isn't a particular rule that they can apply to a country like Israel and say that you have to do it. These are only suggestions that they can make. And also, the also, if there is a two-state solution, the US or any other country can veto it out. Those 5 members of Security Councils are very crucial when it comes to carrying on this particular resolution or finding some sort of solution to this particular problem. So the United Nations has a significant role to play. It has played a lot of role in providing aid, taking care of refugees. It's one of the first organizations which are there. But in terms of two-state solution, it has to go through a bureaucratic rigmarole process until it can actually come up with a solution which is concrete and which you can apply, to this particular problem. For example, when the Israel creation of Israel, that particular resolution was being passed by the UN, the Palestinians did not accept it. They said no, it's not acceptable because obviously they thought that they didn't get good part of the bargain, and the UN or the international community couldn't do anything about it. So it has to be a solution that is something that both the countries should accept. But more than anything else, the biggest ally of Israel, which is the United States, has a bigger role to play in that. And only the United States can, coerce or can come to a certain kind of compromise with Israel and ask Israel to do certain things. And given that it provides so much aid and has such huge defense relations with Israel, can come up with some kind of a solution which can apply to both these states.
I'd essentially take what Sudeshna just mentioned, the role of the United States in taking this conflict to its logical conclusion, which according to a lot of states around the world and the United States, is a two-state solution, right? There has been a lot of browbeating around this concept of a two-state solution. Um, But one development that occurred in 2020 was the United Nations administering what is known as the Abraham Accords, in which two Islamic countries, United Arab Emirates and later on Saudi Arabia, was supposed to work with Israel to bring peace to the region, with of course the United States playing a very very significant role. Um, Under that deal, Israel agreed to temporarily halt plans to annex about the largest part of, or 30% of West Bank. It had a plan to annex 30% of West Bank, which it halted under the Abraham Accords. Um, so Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, also Arab nations, wanted to, or they became part of the Abraham Accords to normalize their relations with Israel. Um, of course, the opponents, there are people on both sides of the divide that do not want normalization in the region, right? They don't want normalization of any kind to come about. And they, of course, claim to be on the side of the Palestinians. Some of them, of course, are Israel supporters as well. But they wanted to scuttle the Arab Peace Initiative and the Abrahamic Accords that was in place. Um, but subsequently, when Trump was, sort of moved out of the United States government, and Biden administration came to power, they have been also trying to take the Abraham Accords forward, and it has maintained a very strong support for a two-state solution, and it has denounced all moves from all sides that could threaten this outcome. And it has been constantly, asking Israel to halt settlements in West Bank, which, according to the Abraham Accords, Israel has halted, by the way. Um, so there is also, because of the advent of social media and the growing importance and the growing role that social media plays, and user generated content plays in the whole issue. There is a lot of messaging that is going on, which has escalated violence on many occasions. In 2002, there was violence between Israel and Palestine, Israel and Hamas primarily. In 2021, there was violence between Israel and Hamas. But we also notice now that the more liberal democratic Biden administration has a pretty strained relationship with the far right Netanyahu administration in Israel. So, particularly on this issue of settlement expansion and the potential backsliding that Netanyahu government has been putting in place on the Abraham Accords, right? But you also have a pretty ineffectual leader in Mahmoud Abbas on the other side, on the Palestinian side, who does not really control Hamas. Hamas is a militant organization that has been declared terrorist by the United States and other countries across the world. Um, of course, we do know that it's an Islamic fundamentalist organization with links to the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Hezbollah, Syrian groups, and Iran, right? So Mahmoud Abbas doesn't control them. So there is a problem, a political problem in Palestine as well, where Mahmoud Abbas is the leader of the Palestinian Authority, who does not have control over Hamas, right? And Hamas is largely a armed militia, which uh, which essentially works on the fundamental principles of radical Islam, right? So that is another problem. It does not really really look at a democratic solution or a non-violent solution to the problem. I'm not saying that Israel is looking at it non-violently. Of course not. You don't see that happening right now. But there is a very complex political issue. There is a very complex political problem going on there, where the Palestinian Authority is divided completely, which is which is sort of putting a spanner in the works as far as bringing about any kind of peace in the region is concerned.
I'd just like to add about Russia's role. Russia has good relations with Iran. But when it comes to Russia, Russia's stand has always been that the US is responsible for this kind of, disbalance that we are seeing in the Middle East region. Right now, that's what Russia is saying. But we don't know, maybe at any point in time, if this escalates to another level, they might get involved in ways and with means that at this point in time we'll have to observe.
So we would end the panel discussion on this note. I would like to thank both of you, Sudeshna ma'am and Roshni ma'am, for coming here, joining us and giving us insights. I also thank the entire audience for joining us. Have a great day. Thank you.